All right, so epistemology, the mind-body problem, and what we'll do is a historical introduction to Rene Descartes. So here are the topics that we're going to be covering today. We're going to start with just an introduction to epistemology. What is epistemology? What are we talking about when we're talking about that? Then we'll look at what I'm going to be referring to as the two worlds hypothesis, which is really just the problem of skepticism, which is one of the main problems that Descartes is attempting to address in these first two meditations that we're going to be looking at this week and next week. And then I'll give you a brief introduction to Descartes through a kind of historical lens to try and motivate why Descartes is raising the sorts of problems that he is raising. Because Descartes, right, is writing at a particular juncture in history where certain problems are becoming prevalent to the Western intellect. And having a little bit of that context makes it useful to contextualize what Descartes is doing in the meditations. Okay, so let's start with one here, epistemology. All right, so the question is, do you take the blue pill or the red pill? If you take the blue pill, you'll forget that you ever signed up for Philosophy 120. You'll forget that there ever was an ontological argument. You will forget everything about Descartes, and you'll go back to your natural pre-philosophical way of going about the world. But if you take the red pill, you'll find out just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Okay, so obviously this is a reference to the 90s film The Matrix. If you haven't seen The Matrix before, your homework this weekend is to go watch The Matrix, right? And if you have, you should go watch The Matrix anyways, because it's a great film and it clearly articulates some of the problems of epistemology that we're going to be dealing with over the next couple of weeks. So there's this infamous scene in The Matrix, right, where Neo is finally starting to wake up to the reality that he's in the Matrix. He doesn't quite know yet, and he encounters Morpheus here, and Morpheus offers him the choice between taking the blue pill, going back to sleep, forgetting that he had ever met him, or taking the red pill and waking up from the illusion that he's in. And Morpheus says to Neo, "Have you ever had a dream, Neo, that you were so sure was real? What if you were unable to wake from that dream? How would you know the difference between the dream world and the real world?" Right? So the question for you is, have you ever had such a dream, right? Have you had a dream that you thought was real? And when you woke up from the dream, you said to yourself, "My God, that was so real. I had no idea that I was dreaming." Right? So let's say that you have had that, you know it happens, and this does happen regularly. And let's say further that you weren't able to wake up from that dream, right? Maybe we put in some artificial conditions here. So let's say I have you in my laboratory on the operating table, and I've pumped you full of chemicals such that it paralyzes all of your muscles so that you can't move. And at the same time, what it does is it makes sure that you are perpetually in a mental state such that you're having a dream that seems more real than real. It seems like it's the real world, right? And I've figured out a way to keep you in this state perpetually. So you're perpetually in this dream that you think is real. Now, if you are perpetually in this dream that you think is real, and someone were to come up to you in this dream world and say, "Hey, wake up, you're not in the real world," you'd say, "You're crazy, right? That's insane. This is the real world." In fact, it seems almost inconceivable that you would be able to tell the difference between the dream world and the real world in such a state. How would you know that you were in a dream world if you took it to be real? If you take it to be real, it just seems like it is real. Okay, so I want you to keep this little thought experiment in the back of your mind as we move throughout the material through today and the rest of the week. But let's talk a little bit right now about epistemology and what epistemology is. So recall to the introductory lecture, philosophy is really all about our beliefs on our attitudes and our values about our world and about ourselves. And one question that arises is, how do we know when a belief is true, right? What does it mean for us to know that a belief is true? Because knowledge clearly doesn't equal firmly believing something to be true, right? You can firmly believe something to be true and not have knowledge of its truth, right? So we saw this very problem with Anselm. You might have a firm belief in God's existence, but it seems to be a whole nother issue showing that you actually have knowledge of God's existence. So the two things can come apart. You can believe something is true, but not have knowledge of that belief, right? So knowledge isn't the same thing as firmly believing. And the question is, what's the further step in order to move from belief to knowledge, or from opinion to knowledge? How do we make that step? It seems like something further is required for knowledge, but it's not immediately clear on the face of it what is required. So philosophers have studied what is involved in knowing that some claim is true. And we call this branch of philosophy epistemology. Episteme is the Greek for knowledge. And of course, the ology is the study of. So epistemology, the study of knowledge. This is a particular branch of philosophy that we are going to be exploring the central question of epistemology through the lens of Descartes over the next couple of weeks. Okay, so most of the time, we probably put this in such a way that we're not concerned with knowledge per se. Oh, that does seem to be our concern, but kind of in the background, what we really seem to be concerned with is whether or not a belief that we have is justified, right? How the kind of evidence that we have to suppose that the belief that we hold is true. And a lot of philosophers have thought that this is kind of what's needed for a theory of knowledge, a theory of justified true belief. So I'm going to introduce this formulation here that we saw a couple of lectures ago, this phrase, if and only if, right? So whenever you see this phrase, if and only if, what that means is that an attempt is going to be made to give a very precise definition for some concept or term. So we see the formulation here, S knows that P, if and only if. S here stands for the knowing subject. So S here is the subject, that's you, or that's me. And we want to say that the subject knows that P just stands for some proposition, some truth claim, right? Some belief. S knows that some proposition is true if and only if, and now we're going to be given the necessary and sufficient conditions for S knowing that P. One of those conditions seems to be that the belief is in fact true. So S knows that P if and only if, one, P is true, so they have a true belief, and two, S believes that P is true. So we're going to say that S has knowledge that P is true if and only if P is in fact true, and S believes that P is true. Do you think that's enough to say that S knows that P? If those two conditions are met, would you say, yeah, that seems like the subject knows that the belief that they hold is, in fact, true. They have knowledge. Joseph, you say no. Why do you say no?
Well, it just seems like, I mean, it's just kind of like an intuitive feeling, but like there isn't like a, in addition, like there's like another condition is like, if P is true and S believes in P, well, that doesn't mean it's like hard to explain, but it's like a gut feeling. I know there's like something missing. I just can't explain it.
Okay, so you actually just brought up a really interesting point too, Joseph. It's just the idea that we have these intuitions that are sometimes hard to explain. And I want you to be out on the lookout for those intuitions because they can often be pointing you in a direction, and it's up to you to sort of ferret out further why you're having that intuition. And your intuition, I think, here is totally right that this isn't quite enough for S knowing that P. So let me give you a thought experiment, right? Or an example. Let's say we have a jury, okay? And on this jury is a bigoted juror, right? So this is a juror who has this ingrained prejudice against a certain sort of person. It could be because of their race or ethnicity or because of their sexual orientation or anything else. Right. So this person has negative opinions about a certain class of people because they have this ingrained prejudice. Right. So this is one member of the jury. And the person being accused of the crime, right? The defendant is actually just such a person that this bigoted juror has a prejudice against. Okay, so the defendant who is being accused of the crime, we're just going to posit that they have in fact committed the crime, right? They have in fact committed the crime. Of course, the jury doesn't know this yet. None of the evidence really has been given. But the bigoted juror comes to the conclusion that the defendant is guilty on the basis of their prejudice alone. Right? So they come to that conclusion because they have this prejudice, because they're bigoted. Now, in a case like that, it looks like they have a true belief because the defendant really is guilty. And the bigoted juror has a true belief that the defendant committed the crime. And the juror obviously believes that. But why wouldn't we say that the juror in that case has knowledge that the defendant is guilty?
Because there's no other like proof or evidence. Because in order to prove a crime, you have to go, well, a person did A and B and C, so we have to justify it with that, not just because they are who they are.
That's right. Because the bigoted juror just gets it right on the basis of accident alone. It just so happens that their prejudice leads them to a true belief in that particular instance. But it could have just as easily led them to a false belief. So it doesn't really seem like they have knowledge, right? They're just getting it right by accident. What we seem to want is that the subject actually has justification or evidence for the belief, right? And in the case of a court of law, you need sort of a certain degree of evidence to justify the conclusion that the defendant is in fact guilty. Now, so we can see that's the theory of justified true belief, right? The subject, the knowing subject, believes that P is true, P is actually true, and they have justification or evidence for believing that it's true. Now, there's a question here which opens up as like, what counts as adequate justification, right? Because you might think the level of justification we need in a court of law is, for instance, different from the sort of level of justification we need in mathematics, right? Not the same levels of justification. So open question here about what counts as adequate justification. And this is going to be something that we're exploring within the philosophical context, because there's another question that arises from this. How do we justify philosophical beliefs, right? Philosophical beliefs don't seem to be exactly the same as beliefs about whether or not somebody is guilty of committing a crime, which is an empirical belief. And in some sense, they can even be different from like mathematical propositions and so forth. So how do we justify philosophical beliefs? Like what does it require? Like what kind of justification would we need in order to say that we have knowledge that God exists, for instance? Right? Now you might think there is no answer to that question, but it's not the only philosophical belief that arises, because philosophical beliefs are presupposed by much of what we know and think about the world and how we act in the world. So let's just take a very fundamental philosophical belief that we presuppose in basically all of our thought and talk about the world. Our belief that the world actually exists, right? That there is a world, an objective world that we exist within. That's a philosophical belief, right? It's one of those big beliefs, one of those big questions. How can we justify a claim like that? Because a claim like that our world exists, it's presupposed in all of our daily life, right? If I just don't believe that the world exists, I might not pay my bills. And if I don't pay my bills, then my lights go out, right? So having that presupposed belief grounds a lot of what we think we know about the world. And it's also presupposed in the physical sciences, right? If there weren't a material world to study, science wouldn't get off the ground to begin with. And most of us don't think that beliefs like this actually need any justification. Some philosophers don't even think that. But it turns out that that is a belief we presuppose. And so it can become the subject of philosophical investigation. How do we really know that a claim like the world exists is in fact true? It turns out that whether or not we can claim to have knowledge about a belief like that is controversial, right? It's not clear how to achieve knowledge, what would justify such a belief. And that's a part of what we're going to be exploring, is just how tricky certain fundamental beliefs like this actually are. Okay, so that is an attempt to try and motivate for you the problem of epistemology, right? How do we know what we know? And in particular, how do we know that certain philosophical beliefs that we take for granted in our daily lives, in our theoretical activities, such as in physics or in the sciences, are actually true, right? That's what epistemologists are attempting to study, is the kind of justification that we can get for beliefs like that. So let me put things to you this way and make a distinction between what we're going to call appearances and, on the other hand, reality. So appearance and reality. So sometimes the way that things appear to us is different from the way things actually are out there in the world, right? Have any of you had that experience where you said, I thought it was this way, but it actually turned out not to be that way, right? You've probably had that experience before, where things appeared to you in one way, and then you soon realized that that wasn't the case, that the way it seemed to you wasn't the way it actually was. A very common way in which this occurs is in perception, right? Have you ever had the experience, for instance, of looking at a very large object from a far distance? If you're looking at a very large object from a distance, it appears small, right? It looks small. If you're perceiving it on the horizon, for instance, a huge castle might appear like a little trash can if you're looking at it from far away. And then as you start to move closer, it is revealed to you that this is a much larger structure than you originally made it out to be. So your perception was being misled by a kind of optical illusion, right? So the way things appeared to you came apart from the way in which things actually were. You might have had the experience of driving when really tired in poor observational conditions. And you think you see an animal running across the road. Maybe you even hit your brakes. And soon you realize that it was only like a paper bag or something like that floating across the road. And you say, whoa, I thought that was something other than what it was. So you misperceived the situation. It seemed to you one way in the instance, but then it turned out to be a different way upon further reflection. So sometimes the way things appear is different from the way things actually are. Another way of putting this is that sometimes the way in which we experience things subjectively can come apart from the way things are objectively, right? So the way in which we experience the world is always through this point of view, through this subjective point of view, right? You've got your point of view, I've got my point of view, and they're actually a little bit different because we're constituted slightly differently. So there's this unique point of view that we all have on the world, a way in which the world appears to us. But then we also assume that there is some way that the world is independently of how we're perceiving it, right? That there is an objective world out there beyond our senses that we are viewing in a particular way through the subjectivity of our point of view. Now, it makes sense then how these two things could come apart, because our point of view is particular, right? It's the way in which we are particularly constituted and hooked up to the world. But the world is out there independently of how things appear to us. Well, one way of thinking about this is imagine what the world looks like through the perceptual system of a bat, right? Bats use, for instance, echolocation to move around in the world. Very different from our perceptual system, right? Very different way of moving around the world. So it's actually kind of hard to imagine what the world might actually look like from the perspective of a bat. It probably looks very different from the way the world looks to us. And that's because the bat has a very different point of view, radically different point of view from the kind of point of view we have. Now, it seems like the bat is interacting with the objective world in just the way that we are interacting with the objective world. But we see that objective world very differently from our subjective point of view, which seems to indicate that our subjectivity can, in some cases, be misleading, or lead us to think that things are a certain way when they're actually not. Okay, so the appearance is the way things appear to us through our subjective point of view. The reality is the way things really are objectively out there in the world. So the question here that's going to motivate our epistemological considerations is, how do we know that our inner world of experience and thought actually corresponds to an outer world of objective facts? How do we know that? How do we know that when some belief we've formed through our subjective interaction with the world actually corresponds to a world out there objectively? That's going to be the question which is motivating our epistemological considerations. Okay, so that's epistemology, right? Now, what I want to do is develop on this idea of the distinction between appearance and reality by pointing you to what we're going to call the two worlds hypothesis, which is really just another way of stating what is known as the problem of skepticism. Okay, so the two worlds hypothesis, what is the two worlds hypothesis? Let's go back to our appearance and reality distinction. I'm going to put this to you in just a slightly different way. This should look just like what we were talking about a moment ago, said slightly differently. So there's really two different standpoints from which we can view the world. One is the objective standpoint. We'll call it a third person point of view, where we look at things outside of our own individual perspective. So this standpoint is a way of considering the world independently of how the world appears to us, right? So we try to take this objective point of view and step outside of our own individual subjective perspective and see how things really are. And so this is, for instance, the type of standpoint that physics works from. Right? So if you take a claim like the speed of light is a universal physical constant, that seems like an objectively true claim. It's a claim about the way the world really is. And the reason why we can say that is that this claim seems to be true irregardless of how your perceptual system is hooked up, right? It doesn't matter where you were born, what language you speak, you can come to know that a claim like this is true. You could express this in German, you could express it in Chinese, you could express it in Farsi, and you can know that a claim like this is true independently of how the world appears to you through your physical senses. And presumably, if there were a race of beings who had radically different perceptual systems than the ones that we have, right? So just imagine some kind of alien race who is constructed in a way that's totally different from us. As long as they're rational and numerate, they seem to be able to grasp claims like this too. That would seem open to them to be able to understand, even if we saw the world in radically different ways. And that's because we can share that objective third person point of view, which is independent of any perspective on the world. Right? So that's the objective point of view. And then the subjective standpoint, the subjective view, is it always occurs from the first person, right? So from your particular individual perspective, how things appear to you from your point of view. So a claim like the airplane appeared to be moving fast. That's a claim which is dependent upon your own perceptual system, the way things appeared to you. It appeared to be moving fast, right? Now, depending upon where you're located, it might have been moving fast, it might have been moving slow, et cetera, et cetera. But we can see that from the first person perspective, what we're dealing with are appearances, the way in which things are showing up to us. What we do when we take the objective standpoint or the third person point of view is we step outside of ourselves and we say, yes, that's how it appeared to me, but how are things actually? What is the reality behind the appearance? What is the reality behind the appearance? So we have these two standpoints, the objective standpoint, the third person point of view, and the subjective standpoint, the first person point of view. Okay, so what is tricky about all of this? This is the two worlds hypothesis. The two worlds hypothesis consists of two central claims. The first claim here is that there really is an objective world out there beyond our experiences and beliefs about it, right? So the object in the distance, it looks small to me, but it's really big. And that's because there really is a way the world is out there independently of how it appears to me. Yeah, that world would continue to exist even if I was gone. That seems to be true, right? This world will continue to be here even if I'm no longer around. You might be a solipsist and you might think reality is dependent on your point of view. That's a much harder position to defend, though, and a little unintuitive, because it seems like there really is a world out there independently of our senses. Yeah, we all are we on board with that? Does that seem true to everyone? Any protestations that there really is an objective world out there beyond our experiences and beliefs about it, or does that seem right to you?
One could say that it's difficult to ascertain what the objective world actually is beyond your own perceptions.
Well, that's certainly true, right? I mean, it is difficult, and we spend a whole lot of time, energy, money trying to figure out what the nature of reality actually is, right? How is the world actually constructed independently of the way it appears to me? But saying that it's difficult is probably committed to the principle that we can, in some sense, make the distinction between the way it appears and the way it actually is, right? That it really is there, even though it's difficult to get at it, to figure out what's really going on in that objective world, it really is out there. Okay, so everyone seems on board with that, right? I want to hear your objections if you have them, right? If anything I say, you think of an objection, right? Just come forward and And let's hear it out to make sure that we're not missing any details along the way. So the second claim of the two worlds hypothesis, because it's composed of two claims, we're all on board with number one here, right? Or at least sort of on board, right? We'll say for now, yeah, we're accepting that is true. Let's now see what the second claim is. The second claim is that we never actually make contact with the world in itself, but only with the way the world appears to us in our experience. We actually never make contact with the objective world in itself. That in itself is important there. But we only ever make contact with the way in which the world appears to us. Right? So here's an example. Raise up your hand in front of your face, right? Raise up the hand and look at your hand and just sort of slightly blur your eyes, right? You've all done this before, maybe when you're looking at like, Christmas lights on the street or something, you kind of blur your eyes and you start to see double, right? You see two hands. Okay, now obviously you blurring your eyes didn't cause another hand to come into existence at that moment. That seems to be just a feature of your perceptual system, right? Your perceptual system is making it seem like there are two hands in front of you. Another hand hasn't actually come into existence. That would be absurd, right? Now, what this shows, though, is that all of our experiences are mediated through the senses, right? So yeah, it's not the case that a new hand is there, but what that little experiment is designed to show you is that there's nothing that you perceive or experience in the external world which is not mediated through your sensory apparatus, right? So your sight, when you see a beautiful flower out there in the world, right? Light rays are bouncing off of your retina, traveling through the optic nerve and forming a representation of presumably something out there in the world, right? But your visual representation is arising through the mediation of your senses. Likewise with the things you smell and taste and touch. Anything that you experience has to be mediated through the senses. So in some sense, your mind is actively involved in the construction of your experiences. And this is well known in cognitive science, right? There are uncountable, unconscious cognitive processes going on at any particular moment which are helping you construct a coherent experience of reality. Yeah. And so we know that any experience you have, it is going to be mediated through the mind, through your senses. Does that seem true? That then we only ever have contact with the way the world appears to us, not with the world in itself. Do we agree with number two here? Does that seem true to you? Now, why might that, if we accept both of those things as true, what kind of problem do you think arises from that? What sort of worry might you have? What's the epistemological worry that you think might arise if we accept both those claims as true?
How do we know our interpretation is correct?
Yeah.
Like if I'm like some people are colorblind, so they don't see like certain shades.
Right.
And I do.
Right.
Or what happens if I don't feel like heat well, so I just feel cold a lot.
Right. Yes. It's the perfect examples of where there's a disconnect from appearance and reality, right? And if both of these claims are true, and both of them seem reasonable, like it doesn't seem we ever have access to the world in itself, other than the way in which it appears to us. But then we also think it's reasonable to assume that there's really an objective world out there, independently of our senses. But if it's really out there, independent of our senses, and we never make contact with it in itself, how do we know that any experience or thought even that we ever have about that world really corresponds to the way in which things actually are? I mean, that just seems like a fundamental disconnect if we take both of those claims as true, right? How do we make contact with the world itself? How can we really be sure that our experience is an experience of reality? So that's the two worlds hypothesis. It just says, hey, both these claims are true. There's an objective world, and we never make contact with the world as it is in itself. But then the two worlds hypothesis, if we accept both those claims as true, it gives rise to the problem of skepticism. Skepticism is the epistemological theory which states that there exists no adequate justification that can show that our beliefs about the world are true. Because if we accept both of those claims, there's always the possibility that the appearance diverges from the reality. It seems to be a perpetual worry if we accept these two claims of the two worlds hypothesis. And so the epistemological and philosophical task is then, how do we close that gap, right? How do we find a way to make sure that the beliefs we have about the world, that the experiences we have, are really experiences of something that's actually out there in the world? How do we know we're not deceived fundamentally about things? Because people have been wrong about a lot of things, right? And sometimes we're wrong, even in our most basic experiences. We think we see something and it's not really there. So how do we know when we have a true belief, knowledge that some belief is true, that it really corresponds to the way in which things actually are? That's the epistemological worry here. Yeah.
Can I give a shot at it?
Yeah, go for it.
So, well, the way you do it is, it's not perfect, but is, well, we look to someone else and go, okay, how do you see this?
Right.
Because if we see things differently, you can compare and you can like, and therefore you can like see the difference or the similarities and go, this is the way things are. Like I go and I look and I say, the sky looks like this color, and I point to it. And you go, yeah, the sky looks like this color. And while they may be slightly different colors, we still say, yeah, that's the same color. We say it's blue.
Right.
We go, we touch a cat, and we say, this cat feels furry. He pets the cat. He says, yeah, it feels furry.
Right.
The cat is furry.
Yeah, that's wonderful, because you know what you're doing there is you're actually stepping outside of your first person point of view, right? Your own individual perspective on the world, and you're checking in with other people and you're saying, hey, what's it like from your point of view? And you're saying, well, hey, there's these similarities across all of our points of view. We all seem to take it to be true, even though there's divergencies from our own individual perspectives. So maybe that thing then is true, right? That belief that we land on through the third person objective method, right? Now, there's that's right. That's how we do it, right? That's actually how we come to more objective beliefs about the world. The further worry here, however, is that in the two worlds hypothesis, if two is true, that also means that any of the thoughts we have about the world are not representations of the world as it is in itself, right? Even the thoughts, even the objective thoughts that we develop, right? Like that the speed of light is a physical constant. If the two worlds hypothesis is true, that's our best attempt to represent what might actually be out there in the world. But if the two worlds hypothesis is true, then we still never make contact with the world as it is in itself. And so there's this lingering doubt that maybe we're not getting things as accurately as we think we are. Maybe we're still missing something, right? How can we be certain that our most objective beliefs about how the world is constituted actually correspond to the way the world actually is, right? And that's great. You did point out like the methods that we do use to try and handle this, but it seems like the problem of skepticism is still there if we take the two worlds hypothesis as true. Okay, so that's the two worlds hypothesis and the problem of skepticism. How can we ever know that our experience of the world or our thoughts about the world is actually corresponding to the way the world actually is. If the two worlds hypothesis is true, it seems like the problem of skepticism arises. And this is one of the central issues that Descartes is attempting to address. And I want to try and motivate this for you to show that this isn't just the result of some philosopher thinking about something in their room by pondering upon it really hard. It's actually a concern that arises out of a very long historical and process of intellectual development. Okay, so let's move into that now. The 7th century, which is the time in which Descartes was writing, saw a radical development of science and philosophy. So prior to the 17th century, the geocentric model of the universe of Aristotle and Ptolemy held sway. So what's the geocentric model of the universe? This is the idea that the Earth is at the center of the solar system, and everything else in the universe exists in sort of concentric spheres moving out from the Earth, right? And so physics and astronomy and all of that was based upon this Aristotelian Ptolemaic model of the universe. And this model of the universe was taken to be true up into the 17th century. It was basically Aristotle and revealed scripture, the Bible and the Quran, the Bible in the Western European world and the Quran in the Islamic world. That and Aristotle were like the two authorities. So if you wanted to know what was true, you would appeal to Aristotle or to revealed scripture. And that's how you knew things about the world. But all of this started to change very rapidly in the 17th century. So just to give you sort of a brief account of the happenings here, in 1605, Johannes Kepler starts investigating elliptical orbits of planets, and that improves upon the Copernican heliocentric model of the universe. So Copernicus had come along and developed a mathematical model which suggested that it's not the Earth which is at the center of the solar system, but rather the sun, and the Earth is one of the planets orbiting around the sun, right? And that's kind of a big deal because then the Earth is no longer at the center of the cosmos, right? We're now just one other planet among many circling the sun. And Kepler starts investigating the orbits of planets to give further evidence that the heliocentric model of the universe is true. And of course, science seems to always develop in tandem with technology. And in 1608, the first refracting telescopes appeared. And this was huge, right? Because we could now actually make observations with mathematical precision that we could never have made before. And in 1610, Galileo Galilei observes the moons of Jupiter. And by observing the elliptical orbits of the moons of Jupiter, Galileo provides undeniable, uncontrovertible proof that the Earth is not at the center of the solar system, but the sun is. So it provides empirical, concrete evidence for the heliocentric hypothesis that the Earth is at the center of the solar system. And this is a radical development, right? It upends the way in which people had understood the world for thousands of years. This is a shock to religion. This is a shock to the Aristotelian scholastic way of understanding the world. And it's a huge development. And the smartest people in Europe had taken things to be true that weren't for thousands of years. And the intellectuals during the 17th century are a little bit worried about this, right? So they're saying to themselves, how could it be that we were so certain that the universe worked a certain way, and then we were shown to be fundamentally wrong about that? How could that be the case? Colby, go ahead.
So it was kind of like a fear that they've gotten this one thing wrong, so they could have gotten so many other things wrong. It's just like
Yeah,
one long founded belief.
yeah. And of course, there's like innumerable other beliefs that people had gotten wrong. Aristotle was spectacularly wrong about a number of things, right? But yeah, that's the worry, right? And it's a serious worry, which motivated the major intellectuals and thinkers of the time, right? How could it be that the smartest people in Europe had held fundamentally flawed beliefs about the nature of the universe? These are our smartest people, and they were fundamentally wrong about how things work. It's kind of a big deal, right? Then there's a further question. Well, if Aristotle and revealed scripture were not leading us to the correct answer, what kind of theory should replace it? Yeah. What's the theory that we're going to use in its place? And how can we develop a theory, or at least a method, for gaining knowledge about the world that will correct against such deceit and error? In other words, how do we make sure that we don't get things so spectacularly wrong again, right? Now, this development, this sort of fundamental rupture and crisis within the European psyche of the time is what leads to modernity, right? The modern world. And it's largely driven, as we've just seen, by the development of mathematical physics. And so this development of mathematical physics, which originally Copernicus was using the mathematical models to develop his model, but then we received further observational evidence that some of those models were true, right? So mathematical physics seems to be upending the world, and it's making the old ways of knowing about the world obsolete. And the method that it's providing actually turns out to be extremely effective for obtaining knowledge about the physical world, right? About the physical world that we exist in. So we can see then that mathematical physics is like a huge motivator in the type of intellectual transformation that is occurring during this time. And it's this development that really impresses Descartes, okay? Descartes is really impressed by mathematics. He's really impressed by physics. And this is going to become the basis for the type of philosophy that he's going to construct so that he can help intellectuals avoid making the type of radical mistakes that they had made in the past by developing a philosophical system that is compatible with mathematical physics. Okay, so here's Descartes, 1596 to 1650, and we'll do just a brief sketch of some of his main ideas. So Descartes is a mathematician, he's a lawyer, he's a physicist, he's a philosopher, he is a quote unquote Renaissance man, right? So he's learned in all of these different areas. Analytical geometry, right? You've probably had to figure out how to calculate the slope of a line in your geometry class at some point. You can thank Descartes for developing that method of geometry, right? He developed that form of mathematics that we still use today. But he's also a philosopher, right? And so he's really interested in the epistemological foundations of what we can know about the world. And the particular philosophical school of thought that Descartes founds is known as rationalism. And rationalism is the school of philosophy which sought to unify logic, mathematics, and philosophy into a grand synthetic vision that would act as a foundation for the emerging science. So as I was just saying, right, the intellectuals of the time were really worried about how do we make sure that we're getting things right. And Descartes' idea is to bring the precision of logic and mathematics into philosophy so that we can develop a philosophical framework for understanding the world that can act as a solid foundation for what we do in physics or in chemistry or in biology, right? That's what he's up to here. That's his goal. And one of the central ways in which he achieves that, we'll look at a couple of them, but one of the really important ones that we're going to be encountering in the first two meditations is what Descartes refers to as methodological or hyperbolic doubt. Methodological or hyperbolic doubt. What Descartes is going to say is that the way in which we sort between true claims and false claims is by taking all of our beliefs and subjecting them all to doubt. So there's no belief which is going to be immune from criticism. Any belief that I can possibly propose, I'm going to see if there's any room to doubt that belief. And depending upon the level of doubt or certainty in the belief, I'm either going to reject it or accept it. Now, for Descartes, you just do the doubting, irregardless of whether or not you take the belief to be true. You adopt a skeptical attitude, right? Hyperbolic doubt means it's sort of exaggerated, right? You don't know whether the claim is true, but you're just going to doubt it anyways. You might even take it to be the most certain truth in the world, but you're going to doubt it anyways. And what that is going to help you to do is to perceive cracks in your foundation that you might not have otherwise been able to perceive. So we adopt doubt as a kind of tool to arrive at knowledge. Right? It's sort of similar to this idea in sort of contemporary science that in order to accept a scientific hypothesis as true, it needs to go through a process of falsification. So we have to figure out whether or not there's some way in which the belief or the hypothesis would turn out to be not true, right? We doubt it first and conduct experiments to see if we can falsify the belief, to show that as wrong. And if we can't do that, then we say, hey, this is a pretty good hypothesis. We can provisionally adopt it until any further evidence comes along. Very similar to what Descartes is doing here. He's saying, hey, I'm going to doubt all my beliefs and see if there's any room for doubt in them. And if there is, then I can reject them as foundations for my system of knowledge. But again, it's hyperbolic, right? He's just adopting doubt as a tool. And this is one way to guard against being led into false certainties. The next, which is a little bit more technical, it's a technical idea for Descartes, is what he calls clear and distinct ideas. Analytical clarity and distinctness. And what we mean here, this will show up as we move through the meditations, is that there's a criteria that Descartes holds to determine whether an idea is worthy of being held or taken on as true. And the way in which we do that is by vetting our ideas with the rigorous exactness of logic and mathematics, right? So we're going to use the same methods that are used in logic, where we have this kind of certainty, and in mathematics, where we also get that kind of certainty, and we're going to apply that to our philosophical beliefs and to our beliefs about the physical world. And only when we get the kind of precision, this analytical clarity and distinctness that Descartes is seeking, will we take on those ideas or beliefs within our system of knowledge. Okay, so this is Descartes using the developments within mathematics and physics and bringing those over into philosophy and using those as the basis for his own philosophical method. Okay, so now this leads us back to some of the problems, some of the epistemological problems we opened up the lecture with. Okay, so the world before physics. The world before physics is a blooming, buzzing confusion. You step out into a beautiful field of flowers. You smell their scent in the air. Their beauty is stunning and it overwhelms you. You perceive the expanse of the clear sky above you, and your sensory apparatus is just fully stimulated by this beautiful scene that you are experiencing. Now, before physics, when you have an experience like this, the blooming, buzzing confusion of the flowers in the field, your experience really is a relationship between you and what is out there in the world. Yeah. It's just you have this experience, and your experience is a direct experience of things as they're occurring directly in the world. The world really is the way it appears to you. Yeah, there's no gap. There's no worry that, maybe those flowers don't really exist. It really is directly an experience of things, right? And directly, like your experience of the smell of the flowers, their fragrance, the sight of their beauty is all a direct experience of the world as it is. So in this sense, there is no distinction between appearance and reality. There just is the appearance, right? The appearance is the reality. Appearances are a part of the world. The way in which things appear to you is just a part of the world. And you might think, actually, this is just the way in which we normally go about things. Like I see the tree outside, and I don't think, oh, well, my mind is going through this process of constructing the experience of the tree. And how do I know the tree is really out there? I just see the tree and I say, hey, that's how things are. Yeah. But mathematical physics upends all of this. So after physics, what is there really in the world? Physics is the method for getting at fundamental truths, right? That's how we really know what's going on in the world, is through mathematical physics. But what exists within the framework of mathematical physics? All there really are these atomic and subatomic structures. And even those subatomic structures, I mean, it's not like we have direct observational evidence of some of those. They're still mathematical postulates to make the math work. So we've got atomic and subatomic structures, we've got fundamental forces, and we've got laws of nature. And those in conjunction are what really exists. But what happens to our beautiful experience of the flowers in the field on this view? Right? Before we wanted to say, hey, my experience of the beautiful flowers in the field is like real experience. It's of something that's really existing out there in the world. There's no problem there. But after physics, we know that all there really is are these things that can be known through measurement and math. Atomic, subatomic structures, fundamental forces, laws of nature. So where do things like colors, sounds, smells, tastes, all those sorts of things, all those sensory experiences, those don't exist in the world, right? They're not really there. Our experience of the blooming and buzzing confusion of the world is really just a product of the way in which the physical world out there is impinging upon our sensory apparatus. Yeah. The way I see, the color I see in the flower is not really there in the flower itself, right? We saw that when we saw that our experience of the world is always mediated through the senses. What's really out there are these, atomic and subatomic structures. And we think, well, maybe those are the cause of the perceptions within us. But those perceptions, those experiences are simply appearances. They're not there in the world itself. In some sense, they're an illusion. They're not really real. Now that's a little disconcerting, but that's the conclusion that mathematical physics leads us to. If we want to know what's really real, we measure things, right? But colors, sounds, smells, tastes, those don't factor into that. They're not really a part of the physical world. Okay, and so that leads to back to the two worlds hypothesis and the problem of skepticism. Because if the objective world is out there beyond the way in which it appears to us through our senses, to the way in which things appear to us. And it's also true that we never make contact with the objective world in itself, but only with the way in which it appears to us in our minds, then it seems like there's this perpetual possibility that the world of our experience, the way it appears to us, could come apart from the way the world actually is. So with the development of mathematical physics, suddenly the world of experience is thrown into serious doubt. And we'll see this in Descartes, right? How can we trust our senses? How could we ever know that the perception of the tree I'm having outside is of a tree that's really there? Because my experience on this view is illusory, right? It doesn't really exist in the world. It's not a fundamental part of reality, according to physics. That's the epistemological worry that we're going to be addressing. There's another worry here, which is the mind-body problem. And that is a problem that we're going to be addressing a couple of weeks from now, but it's already developing in the early meditations of Descartes. And so I want you to also be aware of this as we start reading through the meditations. Because physics holds that the world is an entirely physical world, right? And it's known through measurement, through mathematics. But perceptions and sensations aren't measurable, right? How can I measure the experience of the beautiful flower? I say, in my experience of beauty, right? It appears beautiful to me, but I can't measure that. I can't apply math to that experience. It just is the way it appears to me. It's a sensation. Yeah. It's just the way it appears. So it's not measurable. Now, of course, you could say, hey, well, I can measure like what's happening in your neurochemistry, right? In your brain. But again, that's measuring the physical world. That's not measuring your experience of beauty, unless you just think that those are exactly the same things. But that's a controversial view, because you can't directly measure the way in which things appear to you. Yeah. And if that's true, where does the mind fit into this picture? Where do the appearances, the perceptions, the sensations, the feelings of love and of joy and of meaningfulness, how does all that fit into the world of physics? It looks like it doesn't, right? The mind, the experiences of the mind, of consciousness, don't seem to be able to be described by math. And the mind doesn't seem to be made of atoms, right? Because the mind is just indivisible, right? There's no way to take the mind or the appearance of the beautiful flower and dissect it into its individual atomic parts in the way that we can with a physical substance. So how do we make sense of the mind on this view of the world? So there's two problems here. Like, one is, how do we know anything about the world? Because it looks like if physics is going to be the route we come to know about knowledge, that also opens up the possibility that we can be fundamentally wrong about things that seem to us to be true. So that's the two worlds hypothesis leading to the problem of skepticism. The second problem here is the mind-body problem. If what is really real is measured mathematically, then how could the mind possibly fit into that world? Yeah, how can we make sense of appearances as really sort of being there substantially if all that is real is what can be measured and known through mathematical physics? And these are the problems that Descartes is attempting to deal with. So why we have Descartes at this point in the course is because these are some of the fundamental problems of modern philosophy. And they're clearly formulated by Descartes early on in the 17th century. So he formulates precisely what has been come to known as the mind-body problem. What's the relationship between the mind and the body? How do we make sense of this kind of fundamental difference between perceptions and sensations and the things we can know about the physical world? So on some level, they seem incompatible with each other. And he develops a solution to this problem, which is sometimes referred to as substance dualism, which we'll be looking at in a couple of weeks. We'll see how Descartes thinks this solves the mind-body problem and whether or not we think he's successful. What we're immediately going to be focusing on is his formulation of the problem of skepticism, right? What comes out of the two worlds hypothesis. And he claims to solve this problem of skepticism through his famous cogito argument, I think, therefore I am. That is going to be the fundamental proposition that Descartes uses to establish his knowledge about the physical world, which seems a little unintuitive at first, because I think, therefore I am seems like a truth about mental life. But it turns out that Descartes is going to use that as the most certain truth, which can actually ground knowledge about the physical world and close that gap between appearance and reality. And then this whole method of rationalism, the hyperbolic doubt, the analytical clarity and distinctness is going to be what Descartes says we should use as the basis for the new developing science. For all these developments in mathematics and physics, which are upending the world, Descartes saying, here's the philosophical method that is going to guide us through into this new science and this new way of understanding the world. Okay, so this is just a general introduction to what we're going to be doing over the next couple of days. And I want to make sure that you have the first meditation read. We're going to be covering that for during the lecture on Wednesday. So make sure you have that read. If you haven't already read it, if you have, go ahead and read it again with some of these ideas in mind and see if you can't pick up the way in which these themes are being expressed in the first meditation. And I will see you all on Wednesday when we pick this up again.